question. Can you still feel the butterflies? I can. And that's why we're going to talk about this album today. Welcome back to another episode of Waterproof Records with Jacob Givens, your host, Jacob Givens. That is I am he, and we are together. Wow, it sounds like I'm setting up I Am the Walrus by the Beatles. We are going to talk about a very important album to me. It definitely is in my top 10 albums of all time. If people ask me about desert island albums, this is in the 10. We're going to jump in, because I love this record, and if you've never spent time with it, why don't you just go ahead and hit pause and go listen to it start to finish, and then come back so that we can get into this journey together. It is time to talk about Jimmy Eat World, Clarity. Let's go.
Things are gonna change, I can feel it.
If this gonna be that kind of party, I'm gonna...
Waterproof Records. Waterproof Records. Waterproof Records with Jacob Givens.
Now that the intro is done and we've got our clarity on, let's talk a little bit about DistroKid, the sponsor of Waterproof Records. Remember, if you use my link, which is distrokid.com/VIP/waterproof, you get 30% off your first year. There's VIP in that URL for a reason, because you're a fan of the show. You are part of this waterproof podcast experience. And so you can get 30% off. And DistroKid is so easy to use. Honestly, your music's out there so fast. You can get it on all the platforms, streaming on Apple and Spotify and YouTube, and there's all these cool things and tips and tools that they use in the app, both on your phone and on the desktop. So make sure you go check out distrokid.com/VIP/waterproof. I think they're amazing, and you should definitely use them. So it's clarity time. It's clarity time. Now, Jimmy Eat World is one of those band names that they're not, if they're not in your lexicon of band names, you might be like, what a weird band name. And you're right. It is. Not too long ago, I was a guest on a podcast called Band Name Bureau. It was very fun. I enjoyed the hell out of my time on the show. And it was literally talking about good band names, bad band names. And one of the ones that I included as a bad band name, but it still works because it's gotten into my brain and now I just accept it for what it is. But it's Jimmy Eat World. And you might be like, okay, so you're new to this band, you've never heard this band name before, and you don't know the story about how that all came together. Jimmy Eat World consists of 4 members that have pretty much been going all the way since 1993. They had a different bass player initially, but once they switched over to the final lineup, it is essentially Jim Adkins, it is Tom Linton, it is Zach Lind, and it is Rick Birch. And those guys have been playing together pretty much since Static Prevails onward. And that is their second album. But anyway, so in the early days of the band back there in Mesa, Arizona, Mr. Tom Linton had 2 younger brothers. And they were Jim, and what's his other brother's name? I can't remember. He had Jim, and there was another. These are the younger brothers, and they were always fighting with each other. And they're fighting, they're going back and forth, and Jim gets the last word in on his brother during this fight. And the brother in a vengeful move, I think it's Ed Linton, he ends up drawing a picture of his brother with his mouth open and the earth being, eaten. And he wrote, Jimmy Eat World. That was the burn. Yeah, you, my jerk older brother, eat the world. Eat it. And they took that band name and they went with it, which has some really funny things. Not only is it not necessarily roll off the tongue easiest, but there's been funny things, of course, written about the acronym of it, which is JEW, which is Jew. You put that on a t-shirt, it's like, huh. But once you've kind of accepted the band name and you're like, they're a really, really great band, then it just, it's one of those things that I don't even think twice now when I think about Jimmy Eat World. But this album, Clarity, it comes out on February 23rd, 1999. Now, this is probably one of the first albums that I'm doing on Waterproof Records that is nearing the end of the 90s. We're in that final year before we leave this decade. And trust me, I have every intention on this show of doing albums that are outside of the 90s. When my inspiration strikes and I plan on doing some of my favorite albums of all time, I will leave the 90s and go into the 2000s. You know, maybe if we do this show long enough and it goes on for a long period of time, I'll be getting into things that are coming out. But I wanted to cover this one because this was the game changer for me. Like I mentioned up top, it is in the top 10 albums for me of all time. And I was in college when I heard this. I heard Clarity first. I didn't hear Static Prevails. I didn't come in on Bleed American like a lot of people did, because Bleed American would come out in 2001. And that was where they had The Middle, you know, which was a huge hit, and Sweetness. And those were like radio smashers. You know, anybody in the world heard those songs. And so that really brought them into the mainstream. Not to be hipster about it, but I was familiar with Clarity before Bleed American, so I was already a fan. And I'll tell you how I was familiar with it. So as I've mentioned before, I was at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, great school. Really cool time to be going there. And one of my best pals, and he listens to this show, so I can't wait until he hears it, Jarrett Dapier. He was my college roommate. We were really good friends. He's been on Waterproof Records. He was on one of the earlier episodes where we talked about how you'd prefer an astronaut. And he's a very talented drummer. He just recorded an EP with his new band, Fascinator, and I have shared it on my stories. I need to make a video about it. And really, really great stuff, really high quality. They recorded with Matt Walker, who's an incredible drummer who has worked with, you know, Garbage and the Smashing Pumpkins and so many other projects. And he's in Chicago, and he helped them record that album, you know, and it sounds great. But Jarrett was my college buddy, one of my college buddies that we just shared a lot of music tastes. And he was a Chicago suburb kid, so he came with a lot of different bands. Like, we had a lot of overlap. We were both Pumpkins fans. We shared a lot of interest in similar artists that we liked, but he would turn me on to artists that I had just never heard before. And I remember we were roommates my junior year in college, and I remember being in his room and being in his CDs, and he was like thinking of things to loan me. And he was like, he handed me Jimmy Eat World's Clarity, and he was like, I think you'll really like this. He was right. From the moment that album begins, Table for Glasses, I mean, you have been listening enough. You're starting to gather a notion, even if we haven't spent time together in real life, you're starting to get a notion probably of who I am as a person. That there's a flair for the dramatic, that there's a building and swelling, and that, by the way, that sounds like I'm not describing a medical condition. I'm describing the music. I'm saying that if you are following kind of like my brain and my ears, that this is right up my alley, because the way this album begins and it grows and grows and builds. Listen to Table for Glasses, put on headphones, lay down and close your eyes and let that piece of music rise through you. It builds in the, Lead My Skeptic Side, that the way that he says that at the end. And I have a very specific memory, as I've talked about so many times, as being raised a religious Christian kid and then leaving that behind in my 20s. Lyrics like that, even though I've said I'm not a lyric person, when he says, lead my skeptic side, I remember feeling a tremendous amount of being pulled into this, like, maybe I should be questioning everything. And I know that's not necessarily what the song's about. The song actually, I believe, was written, Jim Adkins was seeing his friend perform at an art show, and he was waiting there, and he saw this girl cleaning off a tabletop with the edge of her dress, and she's wiping it clean, and then he watches her over by the candlelight, like, clean the dirt out of the dress. And that's kind of the impetus for the song. So other things that are behind it, I don't know. But when you hear that refrain of lead my skeptic side over and over to the table and the light, for me, it was like, lead that part of me that questions things to the truth. And I remember listening to it and just kind of, eyes closed, head turned up, and singing that part and really, really speaking to me. It's just an incredible song. And just recently, because Jimmy Eat World and Manchester Orchestra toured together, they covered each other's songs last year. I finally saw Jimmy Eat World live in concert just last year on that tour with Manchester Orchestra, and they did not disappoint. I was very emotional. It was so powerful. So was Manchester Orchestra. I cried a bunch that night. I love Manchester Orchestra. They're probably, one of my favorite bands that's in the later chapter of my music listening years. I didn't discover them, I don't think, until Simple Math around 2010 or something like that. But anyway, boy, I'm full of tangents. Thanks for bearing with me. I think I'm just excited to talk about Clarity. But this album starts so powerfully, and it is credited as being one of the most foundational, quote unquote, emo albums for leading up to the third wave of emo, which is in the early 2000s. Now, if you didn't know, there are multiple waves of what is considered the emo genre. The first beginning in the 80s. With bands like Rites of Spring. That is considered to be the beginning of emo. And then you get to the early 90s and, early to mid 90s. And then you get bands like Sunny Day Real Estate. And, they're starting to push into the Promise Ring. And then that pushes into Jimmy Eat World, which is emerging. They're coming out with stuff in 96, and then this album is coming out in 99. That's really the second wave of emo. And then that leads to the third wave, which is My Chemical Romance and Panic at the Disco and Fall Out Boy and these bands that blow up and really take emo to the mainstream. Now, I get a little uncomfortable with the term emo, and the only reason why is because I feel like it's simplifying things. I think that in the early 2000s and during the My Chemical Romance time, that's definitely got that signature sound and the hairstyle that was kind of parodied in Spider-Man with the dark hair over the eyes. We all know that, the joke of the emo and emo this, emo that. It's come back. There's emo night. And then there's people on TikTok and Instagram that dress up and do this whole emo thing with the nose rings and the eye makeup. That's really where we see that scene. But before that, the things in the 90s, while it came from that culture and scene, it was the post-hardcore, the post-punk, and it was very emotional. But it's weird for me to ever throw the word emo on it. You know what I mean? It just I actually don't ever really think of Sunny Day Real Estate or Jimmy Eat World as the same thing as the third wave. But that's just me. It's just because it's just like how limiting grunge was. For those of you who lived it, when they would throw grunge on something, you're like, it's just kind of it's really putting it through this filter that simplifies like a lot of nuance. And if you want to talk about nuance, clarity. It is considered to be one of the most impactful albums of 1999, but when it came out, it was commercially a failure. It did not do well. It's crazy how poorly the album did, and it wouldn't be until years later that bands are starting to emerge in the early 2000s. Then they're citing it as one of their biggest influences, and then by the time you get to 2009, 10 years later, it's like articles are written or like, why Jimmy Eat World's Clarity is considered to be the most important emo album of all time. And once I saw that during my research, it really helped me put in perspective something, because this album just recently celebrated its 25th birthday. It's been 25 years. And so I dug through my archives of content because I'd done a video on the importance of Jimmy Eat World's Clarity to me back in 2001. So I see the anniversary date comes up for Clarity, and I'm like, oh, I have this video that I did about it. I have short hair, and I decide, all right, I'm going to reshare it on the 25th birthday of this album. And everybody was like, oh yeah, such a good album. And I was so happy that I had something at the ready that was only, it was like a 3-year-old video that I could just toss up very quickly. Because when these anniversaries come, right, sometimes you're like, oh shoot, I'm too late. It's 8 p.m. and I forgot. So I post the video and there's a lot of positive reactions. And this person commented, I promise this is not me on a tirade about like somebody being a dick in my comments. I promise. Somebody commented, he was like, strange that you didn't mention that this is probably the most important emo album of all time, or like the first emo album of all time. That was his response. And so my initial, like that's how we took the video. And my initial response to him was like, oh, sorry, this video is a couple years old. And at the time I was just kind of explaining it as an important album to me. I'll have to do better. I kind of, did a laughy thing like, I'll do better next time. And then his response, I think, was something a little bit more prodding. Again, I'm not getting into the negativity. It was more prodding of like, how could I have blown it so hard? And then I started to explain the thing that I just did to you about the different waves of emo. And then he was like, there's no way you knew that, without looking it up. And I'm like, dude, do you follow my content? Like I'm familiar with the different scenes. But I bring up this point about this person's reaction. And what I don't think I realized because of my age is that if you were a elder millennial or a millennial and Jimmy Eat World's clarity was falling in your lap and you were a few years younger than me, or you were one of those people that were heralding it as such an important find and discovery in the mid 2000s. And so by the time 2009 came along, you were like, it is one of the most foundational albums of all time. I realized while I researched this, I was like, oh, his reaction to being like, why didn't you mention this being such a groundbreaking album in the emo scene? I was like, oh, because I had lived in it. I'd lived in that music scene much longer than you have. I had gone through high school and learning a lot more bands along the way and was already familiar with a lot of these other artists coming from, Promise Ring to Sunny Day Real Estate to whatnot. And I was already familiar with them. So by the time Jimmy Eat World falls into my lap, I realized their importance. But it wasn't like this huge turning point, whereas somebody who's maybe 5, 6, 7 years younger than me, where they're landing in the early 2000s and they're discovering Clarity or Bleed American, and they're like, oh my God, this is a game changer. So of course it would feel that way for you. Of course. Absolutely. So that was an interesting point that we all need to remember, is that music comes to us at such different chapters and times in our lives, because you can say, this is the most meaningful album to me because of enter blank, enter words here in this blank space, because of these major moments. And these major moments for me, I'm a teenager until 1998. And then I turned 20 at the end of that year. So by 1999, I am in college. And this is an interesting time. I am on my own in a weird way. Not necessarily. I'm living in apartments in Champaign, Urbana. I'm actually an Urbana guy. If you don't know this, when you go to school in that town, it's spread over 2 cities, Champaign and Urbana. And it's kind of the way it was in the 90s was, if you choose Urbana, you are probably more like an artsy kid who wants to go see theater or shows. And if you choose Champaign, you're like sorority, fraternity, party person. Not my scene. I don't know if it's still like that to this day, but it was famously, if you chose to live in Champaign, you were like wanting to party with the frat and sorority people. But I was an Urbana guy. Around this time, I am not quite with anyone in a relationship. I'm crushing on people. I'm interested. I'm alone. And this album comes along at such a transitional time in my life. I remember walking the quad with headphones on and just feeling these emotional feelings as I went through. Emotional, obviously, emo. Walking on the University of Illinois campus and just feeling this tremendous amount of passion, sadness, longing to find my place in the world. Like I mentioned, the skeptic thing. And I remember it being such a big part of my U of I experience was this album. And so whenever I listen to Clarity, it takes me right back to that time. It takes me right back there. And that's the incredible thing about music, is the way that you can appreciate it now, but it is a time machine. takes you back to these specific moments. Somebody once said that our olfactory nerves in our nose, like smells, is one of the most powerful nostalgic senses that we have, that you can smell something and it'll take you right back to like a very specific time. But for me, it seems to be music is the one. But I talked a little bit before about how Clarity was a failure at first. That was because these guys were getting dicked around by Capitol Records. They were just not being given the support. Static Prevails, which is, really one of their first, Capitol Records albums, I did okay. And that's much more of a post-hardcore album. And it's got a completely different vocalist. At this point in time, Tom Linton is singing for Jimmy Eat World. So he's got a little bit more of an edge to the vocals. It falls more in line with that style and sound. This is before Jim Adkins is the singer of Jimmy Eat World. So they kind of go into the studio with, the label's not paying much attention to them. So they kind of have the freedom to go in and record what they want to do. And they get Mark Trombino, who they've worked with a bunch. This is the first album they work with him on, but they've worked with him a lot since. And he did Blink-182 and Boy's Life and Motion City Soundtrack, and very prolific producer. And they have 40 days recording this. I think they start at Sound City and then they move somewhere else in North Hollywood. And they have time to really let things breathe. They do creative things, like the next song on the album after Table for Glasses is Lucky Denverment. They do two drum sets for that song. So percussive. That song ends up being, I think, in the film Never Been Kissed. And that's what really helps propel them, and they get time on K-Rock. But this album, they're able to breathe, and there's space and there's instrumentation. There are strings and sounds and synths, and there's beats, and they get to just relax. And a lot of the mood and tone of this album was that after Static Prevails, Jim Adkins and Tom Linton are in this side project that's like 6-member band, and they're writing soft rock music. And the whole thing fizzles. It doesn't come together. So they go back into the studio and they have a handful of this music kind of written for this other project. And they bring it into the studio and they start working on Clarity. And people have asked, like, why all of a sudden did Jim Adkins begin singing? Well, he had written a lot of the songs, so the words and the melodies just seemed to fit. He had an idea of what he wanted, and it was awkward and not easy for Tom to take these concepts for songs and just suddenly dream up something, since he didn't write the songs. Jim had an idea. Now, he does sing on this album. He sings on Blister. And what's so interesting is when I listened to this album back when I was in college, I did not put together that that wasn't Jim singing on Blister. That's so funny to me. On the song Blister, it's Tom singing. And it's not that they have the exact same voice quality, but I think back then I didn't really have an understanding of who Jimmy Eat World was as a band. Remember, 99, 2000, this isn't like you just go and get on the internet and look everything up. You don't have a smartphone. So you hear the album, you know that there's a singer. You don't think about them switching. And I hadn't picked up Static Prevails yet to really hear that difference. So I wouldn't know until years later that Tom was the vocalist on Blister. They put that together. But other than that, Jim Adkins sings pretty much every other song on this album except for Blister. And that would be the changeover. He would from here on out be the lead singer of the band. And I think it was what needed to happen in order for them to stand out. Not that Tom doesn't have a cool, kick-ass singing voice, and not that Static Prevails isn't a fucking great album, start to finish, and he kills it on that. But it sounds like a little bit of a different band. It sounds more like what a lot of other people would be trying to do at the same time, if not a few years after. But Clarity helps them step out of that. It helps them break out and become something much more complex. So if they wanted to do the pop punk, if they wanted to do the emo, if they wanted to have something like, chamber pop or whatever, they could experiment a little bit, and they really do on this album. And then, I don't necessarily have, again, like oftentimes any knowledge or information on specific songs, but like I said, for Table for Glasses. I said the thing about wiping the dress, and then the Lucky Denver Men. I'll never forget when I first heard that song. What a hands out the like hands raised in the sky, or like convertible, or hands out the window. Like that is such a feel good song that just makes you feel like everything's going to be okay. Apparently the story is Jim Adkins goes to a casino with his friend. He's too young to drink, so all he can do is gamble, and he ends up gambling all his money away, and that's where Lucky Denver Men comes. But this is a song that was released as a single, and it doesn't, released as a single on an EP in 98. It just doesn't get the traction that they hoped. And they're pushing it, but the label's just discouraged about it. It isn't until K-Rock puts Lucky Denver Men in the rotation, I want to say maybe even like 2000 or 2001. I can't remember when Never Been Kissed came out, but it was literally a turning point. It gave them the attention, it gave them the chance, but at this point in time, they were already dropped from their label. It was like they released Clarity and it doesn't do well, and so Capitol's like, never mind, you're done. So the success that happens with those songs kind of happens after they're already off the label, which sets them up in the perfect way to go to Bleed American and release that with DreamWorks, and then that changes everything for them. But Lucky Denver Men, amazing song, uplifting, incredible. I don't know if the lyrics are uplifting, but the feel of the song is. And those powerful drums, and knowing that there's double layers, it's awesome. Your New Aesthetic originally was called Skeleton, and it was more mellow, but it gets kind of kicked up a little bit more. I want to play a second of it here. Yeah. Lowering the standard. That's all I'm going to play. Don't want to get in trouble. Great song. And then you get it to Believe in What You Want. They said that was a very Police-inspired riff there, and you can hear that. You can hear the Police influence on that. God, I love this song. This album, start to finish, flawless. Like I said, Desert Island album. Let me get to Sunday. That one really sticks out to me because I remember falling in love with that one early on. This was not a skipping album. Table for Glasses played. Lucky Denver Men played. Your New Aesthetic, great song. Believe in What You Want, great song. Then I get to a Sunday, and there was something about the way it opens up with the glockenspiel at the beginning, those really simple things, and then the chorus is the riff, the palm muted riff as we're going through it, and then when you get to the chorus, it slows down, and there's these strings, and then it builds and builds and builds and builds. Jakey loves the build on a Sunday. Such a good song. Let's hear a second of that opening up. Yeah, see, there's that glockenspiel. So good. You know what? I think in the future, I'm going to just do this. I'm going to have my iPad here and play just so I can hear, because it's like sparks the feeling when I hear it. Then you get to Crush. Oh, yes. So good. Crush, I think all that's been written about that one was the drummer, Zach Lind, said that he thinks that probably Jim was writing about driving because he was, with a crush on a girl back in Arizona or something like that. I think that's all that I remember reading about that one. And is this the song? Is it Sunday? Oh, it's Sunday. This is cool. Atkins felt the slower tempo, let the drums breathe. This is on a Sunday. So they included a Hammond B3 organ on this song. And the Hammond that was loaned to them for this song, a Sunday, was Sylvia Massey's. Yes, the legendary producer of Tool's Undertow. I mentioned her a lot on the show. What a force of nature she is and was to the music scene in the 90s. So the Hammond B3 organ that is used on that song is provided by Sylvia Massey. And then he gets to 12/23/95. That is essentially the day before Christmas Eve, Little Christmas. And that is a very simple piece of music that if you were going to move forward on this album, if, let's say you were on a road trip and you just wanted to keep your energy up. Let's say you're driving at midnight and you're getting tired. Maybe you'll skip 12:23:95. Not because it's not beautiful and lovely, but it's got a slower energy because it's just a electronic drum, little tiny drum toy beat maker. And then reversed guitars from Jim Adkins, and it's got little twinkling in there. I think more glockenspiel. I'm crazy about the glockenspiel. It's not only a fun word to say, but it's just always been something I love to put in my own music, and I love it when it turns up in other songs. Again, 10 is another song where there's more double layered, interesting drum work. You listen to this. Just so powerful the way it kicks off with and that drumming. Fantastic. Then we get to a double whammy. Just Watch the Fireworks, and For Me, This Is Heaven. These two songs, I feel like standing up and walking out of the room right now because I'm so overwhelmed with how amazing these songs are. Just Watch the Fireworks. Let me tell you something. If you enjoy a fireworks show, watch a fireworks show to that song. Watch them burst in the sky to that song. And what's so cool about that song, Just Watch the Fireworks, is it, wait, is it playing? Oh yeah, it starts out with like a, here. Sorry, my voice is not very good. A little raspy. Here it comes. Come on. There it is. There it is. So Just Watch the Fireworks starts out very mellow and slow, and then it changes all the rhythms and has these different sections into it. So it's just such a fantastic piece of music that runs, 7:02, 7 minutes and 2 seconds. And it just brings back such fond memories of this time of listening to this album. And if you're not into fireworks, then I don't know, just stare out sometime at night at the night sky while listening to Just Watch the Fireworks. Then we get to, like I said, double whammy. For Me, This Is Heaven. For Me, This Is Heaven. The time signature, the way the beat goes, and then it gets the part where the piano and the guitar are dueling with each other. The da 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 dum da 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 da, and it just builds and builds and builds. Can you still feel the butterflies? This is where that lyric comes from. Can you still feel the butterflies? Oh, golly, this album. Just wonderful. Then we get to Blister, which, like I said, that was the Tom Linton vocals. This one always reminded me, and it's funny because now that I know that it was more reminiscent of Static Prevails on that song. But when I didn't know that, Blister always reminded me of U2. And I'll tell you why. It was the drumming. It was that kind of marching drumming to it. It had this, the way the drums were on Blister, it has a U2 feel to it. I don't know if they were going for that per se. Then you get to Clarity, the namesake of the album's title. And from what I read, they had done a lot of unique tunings. And when they recorded this song, let's hear how this one opens. Yeah, the guitars aren't U2, it's the drumming. When he starts to, and with pride, it's just got that U2 feel. Anyway, they had very different tunings on their guitars and the sound of it. They said they listened back to it and it just sounded unlike any albums that they had. It sounded so unique to them. And that's why it's the name of the album. And I think that's why it got the title Clarity. But then we land on the last track of what was the release in 99. Now, of course, on Spotify and expanded editions, they included things like Christmas Carol, which was a song that wasn't on the album, and then a demo kind of early version of Sweetness on later versions. But if you bought the CD, if you bought the album when it came out, it ends at Goodbye Sky Harbor. This piece of music, I love start to finish. Some people might say I can't get through it because the thing about Goodbye Sky Harbor is it is 16 minutes and 12 seconds. It's long, right? Is that what it says? 16 minutes and 12 seconds. It's long. And it's just kind of, first of all, that the riff of Goodbye Sky Harbor is fucking awesome. I love do 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 do. They said in the studio they recorded an entire reel just playing that riff because they enjoyed playing it so much. The way it starts off and then it drops out. What is so magical about this song is it just kind of goes into this very dreamy picking. And there's just pieces of music that are like this for me. Like, for a perfect example would be the feedback solos of Smashing Pumpkins' Drown. A lot of people are like, once they get to the end of the song, they skip ahead. I fell in love with that feedback sound, and now it's a piece of the song for me. And for Goodbye Sky Harbor, if you give it 2-3 times, you let yourself just get into a trance as you listen to that instrumental part. And then all of a sudden their voices come in with their singing. And then all of a sudden this beat comes in and takes you out of the song. It is just a really, really cool experience. Great way to finish an album. And Sky Harbor is the airport in Arizona. That is Clarity. That takes me back to being in college and having this real sense of shaky uncertainty in my youth. I don't know what's going to happen next. I was an actor. Now I'm an English major. I'm falling in love. I'm figuring out my journey. And I don't know where I'm going to land after. And yet this album is called Clarity. Clarity. And I had so little of it. That was the thing. I had so little clarity, but the album gave me a sense of calm and clarity. And I think music can do that. You know, when you feel just shaky and I don't know what's going to happen, whether it's something at your job or something in life, and you just kind of feel this sense of, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, or I feel like I can't, like I'm out of control, or nothing is within my grasp. I can't feel it. And sometimes all I need is a good song. One piece of music can calm it sometimes. Like I could easily find myself landing on Table for Glasses and letting it lead my skeptic side to the table and the light. That build. How grounding it can be. I know you know what I'm talking about. I'm so thankful for that. I'm thankful for the music love that allows us to have that. And I hope you remember that. Remember that when sometimes life is pulling you and you just feel like, I don't know what's going to happen, or I don't know who I am, or I'm feeling a sense of like you're losing who you are. I feel like a song can take you and tie an anchor around your ankle and just pull you right back down, and you'll go, maybe it'll make you cry, or maybe it'll take you to a place mentally that's hard, or maybe it'll take you to a place that's full of love and joy. I don't know. But if there's one thing that music does, is it quiets everything else, right? Does anybody listen to music all the time like I do? I do it all the time. We're not everywhere. You know, like I'm the kind of person that if I'm in the car, I need to be listening to music. If I'm working at my desk, I need to be listening to music. If I'm just hanging around the house, I need to be listening to music. Sitting in quiet is a rarity for me. I mean, it's probably healthy for me to occasionally switch off music and just sit in peace and quiet. I mean, look, if I go camping or I'm sitting on the edge of a lake, I can sit peacefully and quietly. But I like filling that space with music, and it's probably because it really does quiet everything else and grounds me. So got heavy there at the end, but man, this album's so good. That's going to be it. That's going to be a Waterproof Records. I wanted to see if there was anything else that I forgot to cover in my notes, but I think I did basically. Again, after this album, they put out, there's one last thing I want to share. How can I not share this? After this album, they released Bleed American. And I'm not going to cover that album right now, but it comes out in 2001, and then it's very close to 9/11. So they dropped that off the title because of the controversy. And then after this album, after Bleed American, they released Futures. Now, I have a cool Jimmy Eat World story that basically while they were recording Futures, I'm not going to out this contact, but let's just say I had a job at my earliest days in Los Angeles. I worked at a job, and one of my coworkers was connected to Jimmy Eat World. And when this person found out that I was a fan, this person was like, I've got something for you. And he gave me, he gave me a burned disc, and he said, this cannot end up on the internet. This is just for you. And I kept my promise. He gave me basically demos that were Futures. He gave me a disc of what they were working on. And when I tell you, to this day, even if you go listen to deluxe versions and demos that are released from Futures and from that time, there are versions that I have on this disc that I've never heard anywhere else. I've never heard them on a special release. I've heard versions of those songs and some songs that were not released on this disc that were rough cuts. The lyrics are different on many of the songs. Drugs or Me is totally different lyrically, and it's only really acoustic. And I went and double checked. It's not the same as the one they include as the demo on streaming, on deluxe editions. So I was given this disc, and I held my ground, and I said I would never, ever, ever put it online, and I never did. And I still have this CD. It's still in my collection. It's just a burned disc. So that was such a special, cool thing that I got to have of Jimmy Eat World's, which I got to hear all these songs that came out of Futures. And in some weird way, like, it ruined some of the songs for me. Not in a bad way, but what I mean is the version that I got so used to was from the CD that was given to me. And then when the album came out, I heard the final version. I was like, yeah, I like the one from the demo better, just because some of them were more raw, more underproduced, and they kind of had that, like, not too much thought was into the production yet, and it had a rawness to it. And so I got used to them there, and then they released the album. Now, I love Futures start to finish, but that is such a cool thing in my collection that I have that I wanted to share with you. But I will never name my source, even though it's been 20 plus years since it fell into my hands. But I've never put it online, nor will I ever. I'll hang on to it, and until one day I meet Jimmy Eat World, maybe, and I'll ask them. So we'll see. Anyway, that is Waterproof Records. Thank you for joining me. This was a lot of fun. I know I kind of jumped around from wrapping it up to, going back there at the end, but thank you for joining me for the journey. And I loved talking about it with you. I hope you had a good time too. Remember, the only way this show grows is if you help me grow it. It's us together on this one. So make sure you're subscribed and telling your friends and sharing the videos and sharing the clips and letting people know that it's a fun way to learn about a band. And I hope you enjoy spending time with me. Last episode, I had Vinny Dombrowski from Sponge, and then I do have some guests in the waiting wings for future shows, working on scheduling those now, so I will keep you posted, but might be me again for the next episode, or it could be a guest. We shall see. Don't forget to check out distrokid.com/VIP/waterproof. Get that 30% off your first year of using DistroKid and uploading your music to streaming services everywhere. But once again, thanks for joining me for Waterproof Records. I've been your host. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Things are gonna change. I can feel it.
If this gonna be that kind of party, I'm gonna